Imagine a place where the mountains don't just surround you, they watch you. In Appalachia, the missing are never alone. Every disappearance calls another into the shadows. Children step a few feet ahead on a trail and never return. Entire families are claimed by fires where no bodies are ever recovered. Whole towns are swallowed by disasters that refuse to end. That's Appalachia, and that's only the beginning. Across 19 true stories, each darker than the last, we'll uncover how these hills turn ordinary lives into legends of terror, where history and horror walk the same trails. By the end, the real question isn't what happened here, but why it keeps happening at all. So lock your doors, let the wind in the trees carry that hollow sound and settle in. Because what you're about to hear isn't just strange, it's true. And if mysteries like this are your kind of thing, consider subscribing. So, where do we begin? Well, why don't we start on a strange Christmas Eve, 1945, when the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia caught fire. On Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia caught fire and burned to the ground. 9 of the 10 Sodder children had gone to bed hours earlier after helping decorate the house for the holiday. George and Jenny Sodder, their parents, escaped with 4 of their children, but the 5 youngest, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were never seen again. What began as a holiday gathering ended as one of the strangest unsolved cases in Appalachian history. The Sodders were an ordinary family by all accounts. George ran a small trucking business, the children went to school locally, and the family was known in the community. On that Christmas Eve, the house was full of energy, with some of the younger children asking to stay up later than usual to play with new toys. When the fire suddenly broke out in the early hours of the morning, it moved quickly. George and Jenny managed to gather several children and escape outside, but 5 of their children were unaccounted for inside the house. The fire raged, and within less than an hour, the Sodder home was reduced to rubble. Authorities arrived and concluded that faulty wiring had caused the blaze. Their report stated the 5 missing children must have perished inside and their remains had simply been destroyed in the fire. But almost immediately, George and Jenny began noticing details that contradicted this explanation. The family's Christmas lights had stayed on through most of the blaze, suggesting the wiring was still functional. A ladder George often kept against the side of the house, which he planned to use to reach the upstairs windows for rescue, was missing from its usual spot. It was later found thrown down an embankment far from the home. When the ashes cooled, investigators expected to find remains, yet no bones or any trace of the 5 children were discovered. Experts later noted that even in house fires that reach extreme temperatures, bone fragments typically survive. This single fact kept fueling the family's belief that the children had not died in that fire at all. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that someone had set the fire deliberately and taken the children. Others pointed to George's outspoken views during World War II, suggesting he might have been targeted by the mafia or political enemies. Occasionally, strangers would claim to have spotted children matching the Sodders in nearby states. The family refused to accept the case as closed. Along Route 16, George erected a massive billboard with photographs of the missing 5. For decades it stood there, asking travelers if they had seen the Sodder children, pleading for answers that never came. In the 1960s, the site of the old house was excavated again. Investigators did find bone fragments, but testing revealed they belonged to an adult, not a child. The discovery only added to the uncertainty. Almost 80 years later, no explanation has solved the Sodder mystery. For the family, it was both heartbreak and obsession, a tragedy that outlived them. And for West Virginia, it remains an unsolved case marked by ash, rumor, and silence, one that set the tone for many Appalachian mysteries still to come. On Father's Day weekend in 1969, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin was enjoying a family outing in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Martins had gathered at Spence Field, a high meadow near the Appalachian Trail, where generations of hikers had stopped to camp and picnic. For Dennis, it was a simple day of playing with his siblings and cousins, a normal family trip. As the adults rested, the children thought up a game of hide and seek. Dennis slipped into a patch of bushes with the idea of surprising the others. That ordinary childhood moment would become the last time anyone saw him. When Dennis failed to jump out at the right moment, his family expected him to laugh and appear any second. Minutes stretched into more than an hour. His father, William Martin, began to search nearby streams and trails, calling his name and retracing every spot where the boy might be hiding. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to suggest Dennis had ever left the bushes at all. By nightfall, what started as a playful game turned into a nightmare that pulled in the entire National Park Service. The official response was immediate and overwhelming. It grew into the largest search effort in the history of the park. Over the following weeks, more than 1,400 volunteers fanned out across nearly 56 square miles of rugged mountain terrain. They cut through dense undergrowth, climbed ridges slick with rain, and slogged through muddy creek beds. Conditions were harsh. Storms brought steady rain and dropped night temperatures low enough to endanger a child without adequate clothing. Despite the scale of the effort, no trace of Dennis appeared. The toll on his father was heavy. In interviews, William admitted he couldn't forgive himself for taking his eyes off his son for only a few moments. That sense of regret grew sharper when searchers discovered a set of small, barefoot tracks in the mud not far from where Dennis had vanished. The prints looked as if they belonged to a child, but they cut off suddenly at a creek and never picked up again on the other side. Witness reports complicated the picture further. A family camping nearby told rangers they had heard a scream in the forest on the afternoon Dennis vanished. Later, they claimed to have seen a disheveled man moving quickly through the woods carrying something on his shoulder. Authorities never confirmed a connection, but it fueled suspicion of possible abduction. Others believed he could have fallen victim to a wild animal, or that exposure to the cold, combined with panic and exhaustion, led to his death in a remote part of the mountains. Yet without clothing, bones, or any gear being found, each theory remained only speculation. To this day, Dennis Martin's disappearance stands as one of the Smokies' darkest and most enduring mysteries. And in the years ahead, the same mountains would claim another young hiker, this time during a school field trip. Imagine being only a few steps behind your classmates on a well-marked trail and then simply being gone. That is exactly what happened to 16-year-old Trenny Gibson in the autumn of 1976 during a school field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. On October 8th, Trenny and about 40 of her classmates from Bearden High School boarded buses for a day hike near Clingman's Dome, one of the most visited spots in the park. The weather that afternoon was cool but clear, the kind of fall day that made hiking comfortable. The group was spread out along Andrews Bald Trail as they picked their way through the forest. Trenny was near the middle of the line, sometimes walking with friends, sometimes trailing behind. At some point in the late afternoon, she stopped to observe plants along the path. She fell behind by only a few seconds. When her classmates rounded a bend and glanced back, she was gone. At first, everyone assumed she had simply taken another route or would catch up in a few minutes, but Trenny never rejoined the group. Teachers later confirmed she had brought no heavy gear, no survival equipment, and not even a jacket that would protect her against cold night temperatures. Her small backpack only held the usual items of a high school field trip, things like notebooks and a packed lunch. Once the alarm was raised, rangers began a search within hours. Park officials quickly called in reinforcements, and soon hundreds of volunteers combed the area surrounding Andrews Bald and Clingman's Dome. Searchers swept trails, drainage ditches, rocky overlooks, and ravines. Some areas were so rugged they required rope teams. The grid expanded outward each day, but no tracks, clothing, or personal items belonging to Trenny were ever recovered. Confusion in the investigation added to suspicion. Statements from teachers and students conflicted about her exact position on the trail at the moment she vanished. Some thought she was seen heading off the path, while others insisted she had stayed directly behind the group. That uncertainty made it impossible to trace her movements with confidence. For her family, the disappearance was devastating. They described Trenny as reliable and grounded, a teenager who had given them no indication she wanted to run away. They could not accept that she had simply chosen to vanish or that she had been careless during a routine school hike. Theories soon filled that silence. Some said she may have misstepped, sliding down into one of the steep ravines that cut through the Smokies. Others suspected abduction by an opportunistic stranger in the park. A darker suggestion was that someone among the students or staff harmed her. Each theory carried weight, but without physical evidence, they remain questions with no answers. Decades later, her case lingers as one of the most unsettling disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains. A girl separated by only seconds from her peers left no clue behind, no trail to follow, and no resolution for those who knew her. And in those same mountains, another disappearance would soon unfold under circumstances even harder to explain. She was walking a familiar trail she had hiked for years, and then she vanished. In September of 1981, 58-year-old Thelma Melton joined two close friends for a casual afternoon walk in the Cades Cove area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The route they chose was not one of the long, punishing hikes for seasoned backpackers. It was a trail she had walked many times before, a path she knew as well as some people know their own neighborhood streets. The three women moved at a steady pace, enjoying the quiet scenery of the cove in late summer. Trained rangers often described this trail as safe and predictable, with wooden signs marking the way and enough foot traffic that hikers rarely felt isolated. For Thelma, who had an outgoing personality and a deep connection to her church and community, it was nothing unusual to spend a day unwinding among those hills. Her friends later recounted that she seemed in fine spirits, cheerfully talking about her faith and laughing along the way. At one point, on a slightly uphill stretch, Thelma drifted a few steps ahead of her companions. They saw her round a curve in the trail, only a short distance ahead. When they reached that same bend moments later, there was no sign of her. The wooded slope ahead opened briefly, but there was no flash of color from her clothing, no sound to suggest she had slipped or struggled. She had vanished almost instantly, as if the trail had parted and taken her somewhere else. Search efforts began soon after the alarm was raised. Rangers and volunteers swept through the forest in lines, combing brush, ridges, creek beds, and ravines. Helicopters scanned overhead while dogs were brought in to trace a scent. The searches ran for days, and then continued in reduced form for weeks. Despite the effort, there was no evidence that Thelma had left any trace, no possessions, no tracks, no remains, nothing that could explain her sudden disappearance. That absence of physical clues set her case apart. Many locals pointed out that Thelma was not a first-time visitor who might lose her way. She had followed that trail many times and could not have been confused about its path. Others found it hard to believe she would have wandered aimlessly, especially since she had been in good spirits and showed no sign of distress. Theories quickly filled the silence. Some suggested a sudden medical emergency, perhaps a heart failure, yet her body was never recovered. Others whispered about abduction in the woods, a crime carried out quickly and silently. The darkest ideas went further, hinting at ritualistic acts or organized violence hidden in the mountains. For her loved ones, the hardest part was the suddenness. She had been talking and smiling just moments before, then was simply gone. Friends described it as though the earth itself had opened and absorbed her without sound or struggle. To this day, the mystery of Thelma Melton continues to disturb those who hike the Smokies, a reminder that even the best-known trails can transform without warning into places of fear. If sudden vanishings unsettle the imagination, unsolved murders cut into it with something even darker. In May of 1996, two women set up a quiet backcountry campsite in Shenandoah National Park, not far from the Skyland Lodge area. Their names were Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. They were experienced hikers, trained in outdoor survival, and deeply passionate about the wilderness. Julie worked as a geologist and outdoors educator. Lolly had been trained as a wilderness guide and was known by friends for her confidence on rough terrain. The two had brought their dog and planned to spend several days exploring the park. On June 1st, rangers discovered their site destroyed. Their dog was loose but unharmed, and the women had been murdered with disturbing violence. The brutality of the crime suggested rage or targeting. The secluded location, far from typical tourist paths, raised questions about how the killer had found them. Details of the manner of their deaths were initially withheld from the public, but investigators described the scene as both horrific and deeply personal in nature. The women had been a couple at a time when being open about that relationship still carried risk. Word spread quickly that their sexuality may have been connected to the crime. The murder sent shockwaves through the LGBTQ+ community nationwide. Friends and family not only faced the grief of their loss, but also the fear that their loved ones had been targeted for who they were. Activists demanded answers while national coverage was drawn to the contrast of a supposed safe haven of nature turning into a site of terror. FBI investigators and park authorities worked the case, but leads were inconsistent. Several suspects came under scrutiny, including men already in custody for violent offenses, yet none could be tied definitively to the murders. DNA was tested as early as the late 1990s, but with the technology available at the time, mixed results and degraded samples made conclusions impossible. The case drifted from active pursuit into a cold file while theories circled for decades. It was not until 2024 that a breakthrough emerged. Advanced DNA analysis managed to identify Walter Leo Jackson as the man responsible. Jackson, who had died years prior serving time for unrelated crimes, was connected through preserved biological samples collected at the scene. For investigators, it was confirmation of what they had waited nearly 3 decades to prove. But questions hung heavy. Why did it take so many years for this analysis to succeed? Samples had been in storage since the 1990s. Families publicly wondered what technologies, procedures, or attention had been lacking that allowed the case to remain stalled for so long. For the loved ones of Julie and Lolly, 3 decades passed with no resolution. Parents and siblings carried grief balanced with the constant uncertainty of not knowing who had done it. When the identification of Jackson finally arrived, there was relief, but also anger at the years lost in silence. The official closure of the Shenandoah double homicide ended one chapter, but it remains a scar on the park's history and a reminder of how justice delayed leaves wounds that never fully heal. 2 seasoned outdoor leaders hiked into a backcountry shelter in Pennsylvania, unaware that danger already waited there. Jeffrey Hood and Molly LaRue were both young guides for a wilderness program, and in September of 1990 they had taken time to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail through Michaud State Forest. They were strong, experienced, and used to remote conditions. On September 11th, they entered the Thelma Mark shelter for what should have been an ordinary overnight stop. By the following day, both of them were dead. When searchers arrived at the shelter, the scene was shocking. Jeff had been stabbed several times and left near the camp. Molly had suffered even worse. She was assaulted and killed inside the shelter itself. Their gear, food, and supplies were scattered, with much of it left behind. What stood out most was the sheer level of violence. To fellow hikers who had long believed the Appalachian Trail represented safety and community, the murders felt unthinkable. Investigators worked quickly. Among the first key pieces of evidence was a bright red gym bag left near the shelter. Footprints, tracked through the muddy ground, led away from the site and suggested the killer had left in a hurry. The trail of prints gave officials a starting point, and within days, attention turned toward a man spotted in the woods by other hikers, a drifter named Paul David Cruz. Cruz already had a reputation as unstable and dangerous. Once his description spread, hikers recalled seeing him moving erratically along certain stretches of the trail, sometimes carrying a weapon. Soon, police matched him to the shelter evidence and confirmed his involvement. He was arrested without further incident and later charged with both murders. At his trial, prosecutors described the killings as cold and deliberate. The defense had little chance to rebut evidence as physical traces and witness statements tied Cruz directly to the crime. In 1992, he was sentenced to death. For the broader hiking community, the conviction brought a sense of relief, but no comfort about the way Hood and LaRue had died. The emotional aftershocks rippled far beyond their families. Hikers who once felt safe spending nights in shelters now spoke about a shift in perspective. Trail communities began encouraging campers to stay close to groups rather than alone in isolated structures. Some avoided the shelters entirely, fearing that what had happened to Jeff and Molly could happen again. For many who passed through that section of the trail, Thelma Mark's shelter still carries the story of violence that ended 2 lives in their prime. Though more than 30 years have passed, the murders remain frequently discussed when hikers talk about trail safety. The killing stand is one of the most infamous crimes in Appalachian Trail history, an emblem of how even the most trusted paths can turn perilous without warning. Not all Appalachian legends, however, are written with blood. Some are hidden inside strange texts, promising secrets buried beneath the soil. Hidden codes claim a fortune is buried somewhere in Virginia. The story begins in 1885 when a pamphlet called The Beale Papers was published in Lynchburg. It told of a man named Thomas Beale who allegedly discovered a hoard of gold and silver while on a hunting trip in the American Southwest. According to the papers, Beale hauled the treasure back east with companions and buried it somewhere in Bedford County, Virginia. To secure its location, he supposedly left behind 3 cipher texts that would reveal the exact spot and instructions for finding it. Of the 3 encrypted messages, only one has ever been solved. That particular code was deciphered by using the Declaration of Independence as a key, and it listed the contents of the buried treasure in astonishing detail: thousands of pounds of gold, silver, and precious stones. The other 2 ciphers, one said to contain the location, and the other said to name the heirs who should receive the treasure, have never been broken. For many, that detail alone kept the story alive. Because if one code could truly be solved with a historical document, then why not the others? As word spread, treasure hunters poured into Bedford County. Some dynamited hillsides in the hope of exposing underground vaults. Others dug through pastures, orchards, and even church graveyards, certain that the patterns of the codes matched landmarks in the area. Residents grew accustomed to strangers sneaking onto properties at night with lanterns, carrying spades and picks. Yet despite more than a century of obsessive searching, no one has ever recovered a single ounce of gold or silver linked to the Beale story. Skepticism followed quickly. Historians and cryptographers argued that the Beale papers showed signs of a hoax. They pointed out inconsistencies in the language of the pamphlet and noted that no verifiable records of Thomas Beale's existence were ever uncovered. To critics, the entire affair was nothing more than a clever 19th-century publicity stunt designed to sell pamphlets and fabricate local lore. Believers, however, said small details made them trust the account. The letters in the booklet described wagons filled with supplies, quantities of food purchased, and arrangements made to guard the buried treasure, specifics that would seem unnecessary for a false story. Some followers felt those mundane notes proved the writer had genuine knowledge of events, while others suspected the real treasure still lay somewhere in the wooded hills, untouched. Regardless of its truth, the Beale mystery became a cultural obsession. Families moved into the region solely to hunt the treasure. Individuals poured their savings into equipment and trips, convinced a breakthrough was close. Many left empty-handed, some ruined financially, but the lure of hidden wealth continues to tempt new hunters even today. The ciphers remain unsolved artifacts at the intersection of mathematics, folklore, and greed. Whether hoax or fact, the legend of Bedford's buried vault refuses to fade. And while these codes remain locked in ink and paper, another Appalachian tragedy unfolded when a man became pinned beneath stone itself. In 1925, a man's voice was heard calling from deep underground in Kentucky. That man was Floyd Collins, and for days the nation listened as he fought to stay alive, trapped beneath the earth. His story began when Collins entered Sand Cave on January 30th, determined to discover new passages that might draw tourists. Kentucky caves had become competitive businesses by that time, with families and towns trying to profit from the growing popularity of underground tours. Collins himself had already located Crystal Cave, but its remote position made it hard to attract visitors. Sand Cave seemed like his chance to find something better. While squeezing through a narrow crawlway inside Sand Cave, a rock shifted and pinned his ankle. He was completely stuck. Though only about 55 feet from the surface, the passage was so tight that rescuers had to crawl in one at a time and pass food and water to him. At first, he remained calm. Witnesses recalled that he spoke with rescuers and asked for company. People outside shouted down to him through the narrow tunnel, and he called back. Hours became days, and the effort to free him grew more complicated. The rescue attempt soon transformed into something larger than anyone expected. Journalists rushed to Cave City, Kentucky, drawn by reports of a trapped man. Within days, dozens of reporters lined the hillsides near the cave, filing hourly updates. Radio broadcast the story across the country. Millions of Americans who had never been to Kentucky now followed vague bulletins from Sand Cave, picturing a man alone in blackness and stone. Inside the cave, Floyd's endurance amazed those who reached him. At one point, a reporter stationed near the entrance described hearing him softly singing hymns in the dark. The idea of a man pinned by his leg, whispering songs of faith in total darkness, struck listeners nationwide. That single detail shaped much of how the public remembered the ordeal. But the longer he remained trapped, the more dangerous the cave became. Rescue efforts were hampered when more rock and mud collapsed inside. The tunnel was delicate, and every attempt to clear debris seemed to make it worse. After more than a week, communication with Floyd grew faint, then disappeared altogether. Silence replaced his voice. Rescuers tried to reach him again, but new cave-ins sealed off the passage. His body could not be retrieved. The disaster revealed the risks behind Kentucky's so-called cave wars, where competing cave owners fought for tourist dollars. It also showed how quickly media could transform local tragedy into national spectacle. For families gathered by radios, following each update, it was as if they too were waiting by the cave mouth with Floyd's own parents and siblings. His death left an enduring legacy, part bravery, part futility, and wholly tragic. Floyd Collins remained forever in Sand Cave, remembered as America's most haunting caving disaster. From Kentucky's silence underground, we move into West Virginia, where justice once came from a voice beyond the grave. In 1897, Greenbrier County, West Virginia, became the site of one of the strangest trials in American history. It began when 23-year-old Elva Zona Heastershoe was found dead inside her rural home. At first, her death was brushed aside as a personal misfortune. A doctor who examined her gave only a brief assessment, deciding she had collapsed from complications of childbirth, a cause that was common for young women at the time. The case would have ended there if not for one person who refused to accept it: Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster. Mary Jane had always distrusted Zona's husband, Erasmus Trout Shoe, a blacksmith who had married her daughter only a few months earlier. She believed he was controlling, and when Zona died suddenly, her suspicions deepened. Mary Jane later said her concern turned into certainty after she began experiencing what she claimed was a supernatural visitation. According to her, Zona's spirit appeared to her 4 nights in a row, describing in detail how Trout had killed her. The visions reportedly showed Zona's neck broken, her head twisted unnaturally to one side. What made this extraordinary was not just the claim, but the fact that authorities acted on it. Mary Jane carried her story to the county prosecutor. At first he hesitated, but growing doubts about Trout's behavior after Zona's death convinced him to reopen the case. Trout had seemed oddly eager to have her body buried quickly and resisted anyone handling it during the funeral. With Mary Jane's account pressuring him, the prosecutor ordered an exhumation of Zona's body. The autopsy revealed physical evidence that matched Mary Jane's claim. Zona's neck was broken, her windpipe crushed, and her spinal column fractured. Doctors ruled those injuries consistent with strangulation. Suddenly, the case shifted from a supposed natural death to an active murder investigation. Trout Shoe was arrested and brought to trial. Mary Jane Heaster's testimony became the centerpiece of the prosecution. On the stand, she calmly repeated that her daughter's ghost had appeared, explained what had been done to her, and even showed how her body had been broken. Shockingly, the court allowed her words to stand unchallenged. While the physical evidence of the broken neck carried weight, it was her unwavering testimony that captured attention. The jury took less than an hour to convict Trout Shoe of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he died a few years later. But the case left behind something no other American trial could claim: an official conviction achieved with ghostly testimony presented openly in court. Today, a roadside marker in Greenbrier County commemorates the event, describing it as the only known case in which a ghost's testimony was said to help secure justice. For Mary Jane, whether her visions were born of grief or something more, they gave her the strength to press forward until her daughter's death was no longer ignored. Not all strange lights and mysteries would stay in courtrooms, however. Some would streak across the Appalachian skies before crashing into the woods. On the night of December 9, 1965, people across several states reported seeing a fiery object streaking through the sky. In western Pennsylvania, residents of the small town of Kecksburg watched as something appeared to break apart, then descend into the woods just outside the community. At first, it looked like a meteor, but within hours, the scene grew far stranger. Witnesses said they saw smoke rising from the trees and a glowing light deep in the forest. A few locals who ventured near the crash site described an object unlike anything they had expected. Instead of scattered rock or metal shards, they claimed to see a large metallic craft partly buried in the ground. Its surface, they said, was bronze or copper in color, shaped almost like a bell lying on its side. Some even noted strange markings or symbols along its base. To those who caught a glimpse, it was clear this was not something ordinary. Before long, the military arrived. Soldiers quickly blocked roads leading into the woods. They ordered bystanders back and formed a perimeter around the crash site. Trucks and equipment moved in as night settled over Kecksburg. Residents who tried to get close were pushed away, and by late evening reports circulated that the object had been loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven out of town under heavy guard. For locals, the speed and intensity of the response suggested the authorities already knew more than they admitted. Official explanations followed, though few in Kecksburg believed them. NASA and government officials later suggested the fireball seen across the region may have been Soviet space debris, possibly from a Cosmos satellite that had re-entered Earth's atmosphere. But when pressed, authorities provided no recovered fragments, no photographs, and no evidence from the site to confirm it. That secrecy was what unsettled residents most. If the object was only a satellite, why had the military locked down the entire town? Oral histories from Kecksburg families show how deeply it shaped the community. Parents recalled being told to stay indoors that night, while children remembered hearing the rumble of trucks on back roads long after dark. Many said the mystery was not the fireball itself, but the way outsiders arrived, silenced questions, and left without explanation. For some, the official denials felt more disturbing than the event. The mystery gained a second life through media. In the 1990s, it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, which dramatized the events with witness accounts and reenactments. That coverage pushed the Kecksburg story into national UFO folklore, where it remains one of the most hotly debated sightings in America. Festivals and local museums still revisit the incident today, keeping it alive for new generations of believers and skeptics alike. Whether the townsfolk witnessed Cold War space debris, a secret military craft, or something unexplainable, the fact remains. Nothing was ever proven, and the object, whatever it was, disappeared. Kecksburg's mystery endures in silence, and where fiery objects fall from the sky, other Appalachian ridges glow eerily at night for reasons science has never fully explained. Strange orbs float over Brown Mountain in North Carolina, sometimes drifting slowly, sometimes hovering as if fixed in the darkness, always without clear explanation. For centuries, people in the region have sworn they've seen the lights appear above the ridges, glowing against the backdrop of Linville Gorge. The earliest written accounts began appearing in the early 1900s. Local residents and nearby newspapers described curious lights shining at regular times, often in the evening, sometimes described as red or bluish in color. One report in 1913 from the Charlotte Daily Observer described them appearing at 7:30 and again at 10 p.m., as if keeping a set schedule. But oral traditions pushed the sightings further back, with stories passed down through generations claiming that both settlers and native populations had observed them long before electricity ever reached the area. By the 1920s, the unusual sightings had drawn the attention of scientists. The United States Geological Survey sent George R. Mansfield to spend months mapping the area. He used basic instruments like an Alidade telescope to chart the movement of the lights. When his study concluded in 1922, Mansfield pointed to a combination of causes: the reflection of train headlights far in the distance, car headlights on winding mountain roads, and at times the glow of brush fires. To him, the mystery was solved, but in local communities, doubt remained. The problem was that the lights had been reported long before cars or trains passed through the mountains. Residents insisted the glow could not be explained away so simply, and eyewitness descriptions didn't always match headlights. Some said the orbs hovered close to the tree line rather than moving on a linear path. Others described a bluish light that resembled lantern flames floating over the mountain, gently rising and then fading without a sound. Over the years, explanations multiplied. Some favored atmospheric effects, such as light refracting through moisture and gases in the air. Others believed geological activity deep in the mountains might produce bursts of energy visible as glowing orbs. Skeptics clung to misidentified headlights or campfires, yet sightings where no roads or human presence could explain the phenomenon kept the debates alive. Folklore grew right alongside the scientific ideas. By the 1930s, stories tied the lights to a murdered woman wandering the ridges in spirit form, or to battles between native tribes replaying in ghostly form over the landscape. Later decades brought UFO interpretations, with locals claiming close encounters or visitors linking the lights to extraterrestrials. Today, the Brown Mountain lights draw both tourists and researchers. People bring cameras, hoping to capture the glow, though modern investigations often return with nothing unusual. Still, residents describe a distinct feeling when the lights appear, an uncanny silence in the forest, a moment where one feels observed from above. Whether refracted headlights, geological energy, or something beyond current science, the Brown Mountain lights continue as one of Appalachia's most known but unsolved natural mysteries. And if the mountains themselves hold secrets in their night skies, the question of who exactly has lived within them remains no less debated. Whole communities lived hidden in plain sight in the Appalachian borderlands, yet no one could agree on who they truly were. For generations, the Melungeons, families living in the hills of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, carried an identity that outsiders viewed as mysterious and unsettled. The very name Melungeon hinted at their difference, often spoken as an insult rather than in respect. Travelers passing through described them as dark-skinned, with features that seemed foreign in the remote mountains. Some went as far as to claim they were not fully American at all. In a time obsessed with racial categories, such ambiguity invited suspicion. To neighbors, the Melungeons became other, labeled, but never clearly understood. That tension between appearance and perception fueled myths that lasted centuries. Rumors grew wild in the absence of records. Some whispered that the Melungeons descended from Portuguese sailors stranded long before the colonial era. Others insisted they traced their roots to Turkish settlers who wandered inland, or even to lost tribes that vanished after early contact. These stories traveled by word of mouth, adding new shapes and details as generations tried to explain who their neighbors were. To those outside the community, the lack of clear lineage was reason enough to imagine the exotic or improbable. Modern research eventually shed light where rumor thrived. Genealogical DNA studies revealed that Melungeons were not bound to a single foreign origin. Instead, they carried a mixture of African, Native American, and European ancestry. This finding tied them directly to the blending of peoples that occurred throughout early America, especially in regions where strict boundaries proved impossible to enforce. Yet even when science confirmed this, the mystery did not vanish because the debate had always been about identity as much as ancestry. Life under Jim Crow laws complicated everything. Strict state codes categorized individuals as white or black, and anything outside those terms was forced into one box or the other. Melungeons often found themselves labeled mulatto or free persons of color. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 declared that any trace of African ancestry placed a person firmly outside whiteness. For Melungeons, this meant their identity on paper was erased and their rights limited simply by bureaucratic decree. In spite of discrimination, families maintained pride in who they were. Oral traditions passed on surnames, farm histories, songs, and recipes, even as official records refused recognition. That determination became an anchor across the decades. The very term, Melungeon, once meant to cut them down, later grew into a badge of survival. Groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association now work to preserve that history, reclaiming identity from the distortions of the past. Because of this journey, the Melungeons are remembered not simply as a lineage puzzle, but as proof of how identity can blur, bend, and endure under pressure. They remain symbols of both mystery and persistence across Appalachia. And if entire communities could risk erasure above ground, then whole towns could just as easily vanish beneath it. Imagine living on a street where the pavement suddenly splits open and smoke rises out, not from a chimney but from the earth itself. That was daily reality for the people of Centralia, Pennsylvania, where an underground fire burned steadily beneath their homes. The blaze began in May of 1962 when the town council decided to clean up the local landfill before Memorial Day by setting it on fire. Flames from that small dump site spread down into abandoned coal mines that ran like hidden veins beneath Centralia. What started as a routine cleanup quickly turned into a disaster that has lasted for more than 60 years. Centralia was a coal town from the beginning. Anthracite mining gave it purpose and employed much of its community of about 1,200 people. Families built their lives around the industry, even as the mines closed and left behind networks of empty tunnels. Those tunnels became the perfect path for fire. Once flames entered them, they had access to deep coal seams stretching for miles. Attempts to snuff out the blaze with clay seals and trenches failed because every time one section was cut off, the fire found another route through the labyrinth of passages. The fire did not stay hidden below. Heat readings in some spots reached over 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground above began to cave. Asphalt warped and cracked as toxic gases seeped upward. Basements filled with smoke. Living rooms smelled of sulfur. At the cemetery, stories spread that even graves had collapsed into burning voids beneath the town. People were forced to accept that their small community sat on top of a furnace. One of the most alarming moments came in 1981, when the earth suddenly opened into a sinkhole, nearly swallowing a 12-year-old boy. He survived by clinging to exposed roots while smoke and hot steam poured from the ground around him. Incidents like that made it impossible to ignore that Centralia's streets and yards were no longer safe. By that time, most mines were already abandoned, so jobs had long since left the region. Now, families faced the loss of their homes as well. The government stepped in, offering buyouts and relocation to residents. Businesses closed, churches were dismantled, and cemeteries were moved. Elderly homeowners sat on porches watching bulldozers demolish the houses they had lived in for decades. Many wept as entire blocks disappeared in a matter of weeks. Even after relocation efforts, a few stubborn residents refused to move. They remained in empty neighborhoods as neighbors vanished around them, legally barred from passing their properties down to future generations. By 1992, Centralia's postal code was erased. All that remained were abandoned homes, broken pavement, and smoke leaking from grassy hillsides. The fire is still burning today, and geologists say it could burn for over another century. Graffiti now covers the old highways, and tourists call it the real Silent Hill. But for those who once lived there, it was no attraction. Centralia stands as proof of what hidden fires can do to a community, showing how mining left scars that could erase a town forever. Knocks, shadows, foul smells, then scratches that broke across human skin. For the Smurl family in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, these weren't one-off experiences, but events they said spanned 15 years. They moved into a simple duplex on Chase Street in 1973, hoping for stability and a place to raise their children. Within a year, ordinary life turned into a cycle of unexplained disturbances that only grew worse over time. It started subtly. Jack and Janet Smurl noticed odd noises after they unpacked, rapping sounds behind walls, shadows that seemed to move across hallways, and sudden waves of foul odors. Then things escalated quickly. Furniture shifted when no one touched it. Their bed shook hard during the night. Even the family dog, they claimed, was one day thrown against a wall without warning. These events bred a constant feeling of unease, a sense that an unseen presence had rooted itself inside the house. The strangeness grew into direct attacks. Family members alleged scratches appeared on their bodies. In some accounts, physical and even sexual assaults were described. Whispers and growls echoed through the duplex, and objects were said to slide or fly across rooms. The Smurls told neighbors and relatives that what they were living through no longer felt like a haunting, but rather a siege. In 1986, after more than a decade of torment, they called in well-known investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed Warren described what he found as the work of a very powerful demonic force. He claimed to have captured evidence on audio tape, documenting the sounds of the entity moving within the house. The Warrens' reputation drew national attention to the case, presenting it as one of the strongest examples yet of violent supernatural activity, but others disagreed entirely. Skeptics argued that what the Smurls experienced could be explained by natural causes or stress. Paul Kurtz of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal dismissed the story as a hoax, a charade, a ghost story. He suggested the family may have been misinterpreting delusions, hallucinations, or even environmental effects like gas leaks that cause illness and confusion. With no verifiable recordings or hard evidence, critics said the story collapsed under scrutiny. The local Catholic diocese tried to take a measured response. Several priests visited the home, blessed the rooms, and prayed with the family. Some of these efforts were later described as exorcisms, but according to Janet Smurl, the demons seemed to avoid them, moving into different sections of the house or even following the family to other locations. Despite the lack of proof, the case exploded in popular culture. The family's account was published in the 1986 book, The Haunted, and in 1991, 20th Century Fox produced a made-for-TV movie by the same name. Both works presented a chilling reenactment of the events, though critics doubted their accuracy. For the Smurl daughters, no dramatic retelling was needed. They later recalled being attacked at night, memories that scarred them into adulthood. Whether paranormal or psychological, the haunting left the family with years of fear they never escaped. But if unseen forces tormenting a family sound horrifying, what follows is something even more tangible, something towering and physical waiting in the dark. Children in Flatwoods, West Virginia, thought they were running up the hillside to see a meteor. It was the evening of September 12, 1952, when a glowing object streaked across the sky and appeared to come down on G. Bailey Fisher's farm. For a group of boys, including brothers Edward and Freddie May, the strange light felt like a once-in-a-lifetime sighting worth chasing. They grabbed friends, called for their mother Kathleen, and brought along a National Guardsman named Eugene Lemon, then began climbing toward the glow in the dark. What they said they found was nothing like a fallen rock from the heavens. At the edge of the field, the group described mist rising, carrying a pungent chemical smell that stung their throats. Out of that haze stood a towering figure. They estimated it at nearly 10 feet tall. Its eyes shone a deep red-orange fixed into what they described as a spade-shaped head, wide at the top and narrowing at the chin. The body underneath looked like a metallic suit or a dark dress that seemed to reach the ground. Most unsettling were its arms, long, mechanical-looking, tipped with claws that extended out as it glided silently across the grass. The witnesses later said the air burned their lungs. Lemon gagged. The boys felt nauseous, their stomachs turned, and several vomited not just that night but for days after. Throat irritation lingered, and the combination of physical sickness and terror made the encounter one of the most disturbing events of their lives. Today, those symptoms are noted by some as consistent with chemical exposure, while skeptics at the time suggested the children were simply panicked into hysteria. Officials gave their own explanation soon after. They argued the streak of light across the sky had been a meteor, and the creature in the mist was likely nothing more than a barn owl perched high, distorted by shadows and fear. To many in Flatwoods, that answer sounded hollow. They insisted this wasn't a bird or a trick of the night, but something they had never seen before, an alien visitor, or even a weapon fallen from above during the Cold War. The shock of the event didn't fade. Over the years, Flatwoods made the story a part of its identity, a small museum open to display artwork and keepsakes tied to the sighting. Shops created souvenirs and festivals celebrated the monster. The original drawing made from Kathleen May's description, with its lantern-shaped head and long suit, still influences how the creature is depicted in cartoons and video games decades later. School children who were there told the story even as adults, saying the fear of that night never left. For them, it was not folklore or exaggeration. They carried the same images in memory for life. And from those testimonies, the Flatwoods Monster became one of the most iconic tales of America's UFO era. Yet compared to what another West Virginia town would experience just over a decade later, this hilltop encounter was only the beginning. Red glowing eyes stared down motorists on back roads outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Starting in November of 1966, witnesses described seeing a winged man-shaped creature that terrified anyone who came near it. The first reported encounter came from two young couples driving near the old World War II munitions site, known locally as the TNT area. They said the being was tall, humanoid, with wings that stretched out across the highway, and eyes that glowed like bicycle reflectors when headlights caught them. As they sped away, they swore it followed their car, letting out a piercing screech. The story ran in the Point Pleasant Register the next day with the headline, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something." That headline captured the confusion. Residents didn't know whether to call it a monster, a giant bird, or something else entirely. Once the account made print, more locals came forward with similar stories. Two volunteer firemen described it as a large bird with red eyes. A contractor claimed its eyes reflected his flashlight one night as his dog disappeared into the woods, never returning. Even the county sheriff offered an explanation of sorts, suggesting it might be an oversized heron. Despite scientific guesses, the sighting spread rapidly. People gathered at the TNT area, hoping to spot it. The landscape of half-collapsed bunkers and rusting towers gave the reports a sinister backdrop. Sightings continued into 1967, usually describing a figure 6 to 7 feet tall, gray or black in color, with wings that could stretch 10 feet wide. Families caught it out of the corner of their car headlights. Hunters swore they saw it along tree-line ridges before it vanished. The fear that Point Pleasant was being stalked by something real, not imagined, grew by the month. Everything changed on December 15, 1967. That evening, the Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge over the Ohio River connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, suddenly collapsed during rush hour traffic. Dozens of cars fell into the river with no warning. 46 people died in the tragedy, the worst bridge disaster in American history at the time. In the aftermath, townsfolk could not ignore the timing. Mothman, as newspapers now called it, had been seen repeatedly near the bridge in the days leading up to the collapse. Rumors immediately divided the town. Some said the creature had brought death itself, acting as a curse. Others believed it had come as a warning of the accident, an omen that people had misinterpreted until it was too late. Families who lost loved ones that night grieved under unbearable attention while curiosity seekers poured into Point Pleasant. Their tragedy became tied forever to the legend. Today, Point Pleasant keeps the memory alive with a metallic Mothman statue, a downtown museum, and an annual festival. While the reports dwindled after the bridge disaster, the story never left Appalachia's shadow. And from the fear of one creature haunting a town, we moved to entire regions marked by repeated vanishings and dread, like the infamous Bennington Triangle. In one small region of Vermont, hikers began to vanish, one after another, over just 5 years. This area, centered on Glastonbury Mountain and stretching into the towns around it, is where 5 disappearances between 1945 and 1950 created what people would later call the Bennington Triangle. The disappearances weren't connected by age or occupation. Some were children, some older adults, and one was a college student. What they shared was that none of them left behind answers. The first case was in November of 1945. A 74-year-old hunter named Mitty Rivers separated briefly from his party along Long Trail Road. He promised to rejoin them in a short time, but never returned. Search teams with trackers combed the woods for days. The only possible clue was a single rifle cartridge found in a stream, but even that gave no clear direction. His familiarity with the area made his disappearance even more unsettling. Then came December 1st, 1946. Paula Weldon, only 18 years old and a student at Bennington College, set out on the Long Trail for a short hike. An elderly couple walking behind her said they saw her ahead on the path. She turned a corner and was gone. Nighttime temperatures dropped severely. She wore no jacket and her supplies were minimal. The search for Paula was massive, involving the FBI and rewards funded by her family. Her parents even gave thousands of dollars to keep searches going, but nothing was ever found. They died without knowing what happened to their daughter. 3 years later, to the exact date, December 1st, 1949, 68-year-old James Tedford boarded a bus to return to his home in Bennington. Passengers noted he was present at the stop before his destination. When the bus arrived, his seat was empty. His personal belongings were still there, including an open timetable. He had seemingly disappeared in transit without anyone noticing. In October of 1950, 8-year-old Paul Buddy Jepson vanished while his mother fed pigs near their home. She left him in their truck for minutes, and when she returned, he was gone. Bloodhounds followed his scent along a logging road in the same area where Paula Weldon had disappeared. The trail ended abruptly, and no other trace of him was ever uncovered. Just over 2 weeks later, on October 28th, 53-year-old Frida Langer fell into a stream while hiking near Somerset Reservoir. She told her cousin she would change clothes and meet him back at camp, but she never arrived. Despite airplanes, helicopters, and hundreds of searchers combing the area, she vanished. Months later, her body was discovered 3 miles from camp in a lightly searched area. Her remains were too decayed to give a cause of death. Locals noted the almost yearly pattern. Hunters refused Glastonbury's slopes, calling them cursed. Joseph Citro later gave the area its lasting name, the Bennington Triangle. For many, it remains a story of mountains that seem to swallow human presence without returning it, and decades later, new technology would carry that same feeling of dread into one of America's first viral cold cases. A single-car crash, a missing young woman, millions asking the same question. Where did she go? On February 9, 2004, 21-year-old Maura Murray left the University of Massachusetts Amherst and drove north toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Hours later, residents along Route 112 near the small town of Haverhill reported hearing a loud crash. Maura had lost control of her Saturn sedan on a sharp curve. The car spun and struck a snowbank, leaving it damaged but still drivable. For the neighbors who came outside, what happened next turned a roadside accident into one of the most enduring mysteries in America. One woman offered to call the police, but Maura told her she had already phoned AAA. That claim puzzled investigators later. Cell service in the stretch of Route 112 was unreliable, and records showed no call had been made. The neighbor then called authorities herself. Troopers arrived less than 10 minutes later. By then, the car was locked and empty. Inside were some of Maura's personal belongings, including clothes, books, and the printed directions she had used for her trip. But Maura herself was gone. The crash site was in a rural, isolated part of New Hampshire. Thick woods lined both sides of the 2-lane road, and temperatures that night fell below freezing as snow began to gather. Dogs brought to the scene traced her scent for a short distance up the road, but lost it abruptly. The trail didn't continue into the forest, nor did it suggest she had walked miles down the highway. It simply ended, as if she had vanished within sight of the accident. Search efforts grew quickly in the days after. Police units, helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers spread out to cover the surrounding terrain. They looked for tracks, clothing, or any credible sign that she had collapsed or headed toward shelter. Despite the effort, no trace of Maura was discovered. The more the search revealed nothing, the more theories multiplied. Soon the case formed an unusual second life online. Internet forums began dissecting every known fact, analyzing timelines, phone records, and maps of the crash scene. Some argued she had run away to start fresh. Others were convinced she met with foul play, possibly picked up by a stranger on the lonely road. Unofficial investigators studied photos of the car, debated whether she had planned the trip, and created scenarios that ranged from abduction to wandering into the wilderness. Even today, Maura's father and sister continue to press for information. They maintain websites, speak to media outlets, and organize searches, holding on to hope that answers may still come. Their persistence keeps her case in the public eye nearly 20 years later. The debate remains the same. Did she disappear by choice, or did she cross paths with danger in that brief window after the crash? The absence of evidence lets both possibilities endure side by side. What is certain is that Maura Murray's case, still unsolved, has become America's most infamous internet cold case. Yet hauntings connected to Appalachia stretch further back, toward Tennessee's most terrifying ghost story. Whispers in the dark, then slaps, screams, and curses filled a Tennessee farmhouse. That was the ordeal of the Bell family in the early 1800s, in the small community of Adams. What began as odd noises in the night soon transformed into one of America's most terrifying hauntings, remembered ever since as the Bell Witch. The disturbances started around 1817. Members of the family heard scratching that seemed to come from beneath the house, like claws on wood. Knocking followed, moving from wall to wall. Soon, the sounds turned into clear voices, unseen, mocking, and persistent. Words carried through rooms even when no one was there. The family said these voices grew bolder, laughing when they prayed and repeating conversations back to them in distorted tones. It was not only sound. Invisible hands, according to their accounts, slapped, pinched, and pulled at clothing. Neighbors invited into the home reported similar experiences. Some claimed they witnessed objects move on their own, chairs sliding, bedding stripped in the middle of the night. Unlike many hauntings that stayed confined to whispers and footsteps, this presence spoke directly and physically to everyone inside. The entity seemed to focus most of its energy on John Bell, the patriarch. He was struck repeatedly, his strength drained over time. The spirit hurled vicious insults at him when he prayed, sometimes calling him out by name. The pattern convinced the family that whatever haunted them had a particular vendetta against him. Word about the Bell Witch spread quickly across rural Tennessee. Visitors began to travel to the Bell property hoping to witness the events firsthand. One of the most famous accounts came from Andrew Jackson, who had not yet become president but was already a prominent figure. According to legend, Jackson visited and brought men with him, curious to test the truth. By the end of the night, the story goes, they fled from the farmhouse after being terrorized by the unseen force. More disturbing was the message the presence delivered. The spirit openly cursed John Bell, warning that his death would come soon. Family and townsfolk alike believed that prophecy would not be ignored. By late 1820, John's health declined rapidly, and on December 20th, he died. Rumor in the community held that poison had been found by his bedside, and some attributed it directly to the entity. For those who witnessed the end, the spirit's prediction had come true. Family diaries from that period preserve details about the endless fear they lived through, sleepless nights with voices shouting at them, sudden blows from nowhere, and the constant knowledge that their patriarch was marked. John's death cemented the legend. Locals whispered that the witch had fulfilled its curse, and visitors continued to pass the story down through generations. Today, the Bell Witch remains one of the most infamous hauntings in American history, still unsettling for the level of detail and for its violent climax. In Appalachia, whether through vanishings, monsters, fires, or curses, the fear never ends. Across Appalachia, the land holds stories of people who never returned, of crimes that stretched for decades, and of legends that refuse to fade. The isolation of its mountains and the history of its towns combine to create a place where fact and folklore overlap. These 19 accounts aren't just random events, but part of a larger thread, an atmosphere of unease tied deeply to the region itself. From families erased in fire to creatures said to haunt bridges, the unanswered questions remain. Perhaps the greater horror lies not in what was uncovered, but in what still waits in silence. And that's where our journey through Appalachia ends tonight. 19 mysteries, each one darker than the last. But the mountains still keep more secrets than anyone could count. If you made it this far, you're one of the last two awake. So let me ask you, Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want more true mysteries that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.